Careful, my daughter-in-law laughed loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. If you leave your purse near Evelyn, she might start charging us rent for breathing. She's basically our live-in leech maid anyway. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel at first. It was hesitant, uncomfortable, the kind of laughter wealthy people use when they aren't sure whether they're witnessing a joke or a public execution. I stood beside the champagne tower holding my clutch with both hands, smiling politely as if Brianna had merely commented on the weather. The ballroom of the Hartford Regency glittered with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed mirrors, every surface reflecting money and status. Waiters in black jackets drifted through the crowd carrying trays of smoked salmon crostini and champagne flutes, while executives from Bennett Financial laughed beside towering arrangements of white roses. It was the kind of corporate holiday party where appearances mattered more than truth. Brianna thrived in places like this. She wore a silver designer gown that caught the light every time she moved, and her hand rested possessively on my son Daniel's arm, like she was presenting him as one more luxury accessory she'd acquired. Daniel gave a weak chuckle beside her, though he still avoided looking directly at me. That hurt more than her words. My son had once cried when I scraped my knee gardening because he thought I was in pain. Now he stood quietly while his wife introduced me as if I were some embarrassing burden they couldn't get rid of. Brianna, one of the younger women, whispered nervously. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by... Oh, relax, Brianna interrupted with a dramatic wave of her champagne glass. Evelyn knows we're joking. Don't you, Evelyn? Several faces turned toward me then. Curious. Awkward. Waiting. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress carefully before answering. I suppose humor changes when people become successful. A few people smiled faintly at that, but Brianna's expression tightened for only a second before she laughed again. See? She's fine. Honestly, Daniel says she still treats him like he's 12. Daniel finally spoke, though. Quietly. Brianna, maybe let's not. What? She asked innocently. I'm including her. That's what family does. Family. The word felt strange now. Ever since my husband Walter passed away 8 months earlier, that word had started losing its meaning inside our home. At first, Brianna had hidden her impatience beneath sympathy. She brought casseroles after the funeral. She hugged me tightly in front of guests. She called me strong. But grief has a way of revealing people once the casseroles disappear and the sympathy cards stop arriving. Slowly, small things changed. My reading chair vanished from the living room because it didn't match the renovation aesthetic. My bedroom was moved upstairs because Brianna wanted the larger guest suite converted into a home office. She started referring to my cooking as helping out around the house, even though I'd cooked nearly every meal for that family since Daniel was born. Then came the comments disguised as jokes. Retirement must be nice when someone else pays the bills. I hope I age as comfortably as you. Some people really know how to land on their feet. Daniel never fully joined in, but he never stopped her either. Silence can wound just as deeply as cruelty. Across the ballroom, a jazz quartet played softly near the dance floor while snow drifted against the tall hotel windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Outside, the city glowed cold and silver beneath the December sky. Inside, Brianna was still smiling at her audience. You should have seen Evelyn when we told her we were remodeling the kitchen, she continued. You'd think we were demolishing the White House. Another ripple of laughter moved through the group. I lowered my eyes briefly toward my untouched champagne glass. My late husband used to say dignity wasn't about winning arguments. It was about deciding which rooms deserved your silence. So I stayed quiet. Brianna mistook that silence for weakness. Most people did. That was the strange thing about getting older. People stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as background furniture. Something permanent. Something harmless. Something they could speak over. Brianna stepped closer then, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate, while making certain everyone could still hear. Honestly, if Daniel and I ever split up, I'd probably take the house too. Evelyn already trained him to let women do whatever they want. A few guests shifted awkwardly. Someone coughed into their drink. Daniel finally looked embarrassed, but still he said nothing. I simply folded my hands together and smiled faintly. Then the ballroom doors opened. The movement itself was subtle at first, just a slight change in the atmosphere near the entrance. Conversations softened. Heads turned. The hotel staff straightened instinctively. Richard Bennett had arrived. Even at 72, The founder and CEO of Bennett Financial carried the kind of presence that silenced a room without effort. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair immaculate beneath the ballroom lights. Executives immediately moved toward him with eager smiles and extended hands. Brianna's posture transformed instantly. Her entire face brightened with ambition. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, smoothing her dress, "this is our chance. If you can get a minute alone with him tonight." But Richard Bennett wasn't looking at Daniel. He wasn't looking at the executives gathering around him either. The moment he entered the ballroom, his eyes moved across the crowd until they landed directly on me. And then he stopped walking entirely. For a moment, nobody moved. The music from the jazz quartet faded into the background, while dozens of conversations dissolved into uncomfortable silence. Richard Bennett stood near the ballroom entrance with one hand still resting lightly on the arm of his assistant, but his attention remained fixed entirely on me. I had not seen him in nearly 15 years, yet time seemed to collapse instantly inside that crowded room. Brianna's confident smile flickered. "Daniel," she whispered sharply, "why is he staring at your mother like that?" Daniel swallowed hard without answering. Richard began walking slowly across the ballroom floor. Executives stepped aside immediately to clear a path for him. People who had ignored me all evening suddenly glanced back and forth between us with open curiosity. I could feel the shift happening before anyone spoke a single word. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself changes. Brianna straightened her shoulders and pasted on another polished smile. She extended her hand before Richard fully reached us. "Mr. Bennett, it is such an honor to finally meet you. I am Brianna Carter. My husband works in financial operations." Richard barely glanced at her offered hand. His eyes never left my face. "Evelyn," he said softly. "Just my name. Nothing more." Yet hearing it spoken in his voice after all these years stirred something deep inside my chest. I gave a small nod. "Good evening, Richard." Several people exchanged startled looks immediately. The younger employees standing nearby looked confused that I had addressed the founder of a multi-billion-dollar company so casually. Brianna let out a nervous laugh. "You two know each other?" Richard finally turned toward her then, though his expression remained unreadable. "Know each other," he repeated calmly. "Your mother-in-law once kept this company alive long enough for me to build what you see standing here tonight." The silence that followed felt enormous. Brianna blinked rapidly, clearly unsure whether he was joking. Daniel stared at me as though he had suddenly realized he had spent years living beside a stranger. I lowered my eyes toward my champagne glass again. Attention had never interested me. That had always been Walter's strength, not mine. My husband loved negotiations, business dinners, and investor meetings. I preferred the quieter work behind the scenes. Numbers, planning, sacrifice. Richard took another step closer. "I looked for you after Walter passed," he said gently. "But Daniel told me you were resting and preferred privacy." My fingers tightened slightly around the stem of my glass. That explained the sympathy letter I never received. The flowers that never arrived. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside Brianna. "Mama's been staying busy at home," he muttered quickly. "We did not want to overwhelm her." Richard's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He looked around the ballroom. Slowly, taking in the awkward faces, the untouched drinks, the tension hanging in the air. His gaze settled briefly on Brianna, whose smile now looked painfully strained. "Interesting atmosphere," he said quietly. Nobody answered. Across the room, one of the vice presidents pretended to study his phone, while another woman suddenly became very interested in rearranging cocktail napkins on a nearby table. Wealthy people often believed humiliation only existed when someone shouted. They never noticed how cruelty thrived in whispers, introductions, and carefully timed laughter. Richard noticed. He had spent too many years navigating boardrooms not to. "Evelyn," he said after a moment, "would you walk with me for a minute?" Brianna immediately stepped forward again. "Of course. We would love to join you." Richard looked directly at her. "I was speaking to Evelyn." The correction landed softly, but with enough force to drain the color from Brianna's face. I set my champagne glass onto a passing tray and followed Richard toward the quieter side of the ballroom, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Snow continued drifting steadily outside, covering the streets of Chicago in silver light. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Richard sighed heavily. Walter would hate this, he said. I stared out at the snow. Walter hated conflict. No, Richard replied quietly. Walter hated watching good people diminish themselves to keep peace for others. That sentence stayed with me because it was true. After my husband died, I had spent months convincing myself that endurance was the same thing as kindness. Every small insult I ignored became permission for another one. Every silence created more distance between Daniel and me until I barely recognized my own son anymore. Richard rested one hand against the window frame. I remember the first office, he said suddenly with a faint smile. Tiny little building off Madison Street. Leaking pipes. Bad coffee. Walter trying to charm investors while you balanced payroll checks at the kitchen table. I smiled despite myself. You forgot the broken air conditioner. How could I forget? We nearly melted that summer. For the first time all evening, warmth touched my chest instead of shame. Those years had not been glamorous. Walter and I had mortgaged nearly everything we owned to help stabilize the company during a financial crisis no one believed they would survive. We missed vacations, delayed repairs on our own home, sold jewelry I inherited from my mother. Not because we expected recognition, but because we believed in loyalty. Somewhere behind us, the ballroom noise slowly resumed, though quieter now. People were watching, listening, recalculating. Richard looked at me carefully. Evelyn, he said, lowering his voice. Do they even know who you are? I thought about Brianna calling me a leech in front of strangers. I thought about Daniel standing silent beside her. Then I looked down at the city lights glowing beneath the snow and answered honestly, no. And I believe that was exactly how they wanted it. When Richard and I returned to the center of the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by the strained politeness people use when they realize they may have witnessed something important. Conversations resumed in low, careful voices. Employees who had barely acknowledged me before now offered small nods and uncertain smiles as I passed. Brianna noticed every single one of them. Her expression remained composed on the surface, but I could see tension gathering behind her eyes like cracks spreading beneath glass. Daniel approached us first, adjusting the cuff of his suit nervously. Mom, he said quietly, why did you never tell me any of this? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. You never asked. The words were not cruel. That was what made them hurt him. Daniel glanced down immediately. Richard placed one hand lightly against Daniel's shoulder. Your parents built more than you realize, he said evenly. Your father had vision. Your mother made sure that vision survived long enough to matter. Brianna stepped closer then, her voice suddenly softer than before. I think there has been some misunderstanding tonight. Richard raised an eyebrow slightly. Has there? Of course, she said, quickly with a practiced smile. We adore Evelyn. She knows we joke around sometimes. I said nothing. Silence unsettled Brianna far more than anger ever could. She kept talking to fill it. Honestly, she has been under so much stress since Walter passed. We have tried to help her adjust. Richard looked at me instead of her. Adjust to what? Brianna hesitated. Living with us. Depending on family support. Things like that. Something cold moved quietly through me then. Not rage. Clarity. I realized Brianna truly believed the story she had created. In her mind, my grief had transformed me into someone small and dependent. Someone who should feel grateful simply for being tolerated in her home. The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely begins with one grand betrayal. It grows through tiny permissions, tiny compromises, tiny moments when you convince yourself that keeping peace matters more than defending your dignity. 8 months earlier, after Walter's funeral, Daniel had insisted I move into their home temporarily, just until things feel normal again. He had promised while carrying my suitcases upstairs. Brianna welcomed me with perfect sympathy at first. She bought fresh flowers for my bedroom, asked whether I preferred herbal tea before bed, told friends how important family was during difficult seasons. Then, little by little, the atmosphere shifted. One afternoon I returned from grocery shopping to find movers carrying my antique writing desk out of the downstairs sitting room. We are creating more modern flow in the house, Brianna explained casually while scrolling through fabric samples on her tablet. The old furniture made everything feel heavy. That desk had belonged to my mother. Walter restored it for our 10th anniversary. I remember standing silently in the hallway holding grocery bags while strangers carried pieces of my life towards storage like outdated decorations. A month later, Brianna began hosting networking dinners at the house for Daniel's colleagues. During those evenings, she always asked me to help keep things running smoothly. At first, that meant lighting candles or arranging appetizers. Eventually, it meant serving drinks while guests discussed market forecasts in the dining room. One night, I overheard a woman asking whether I worked for the family full-time. Brianna laughed lightly before answering. Something like that. Daniel heard it too. He lowered his eyes toward his plate and continued eating. I should have spoken then. Instead, I washed wine glasses alone after everyone left while Brianna thanked me for being such a huge help. Looking back now, I understood the pattern clearly. Brianna did not simply want control over the household. She wanted ownership over the narrative. In her version of reality, she and Daniel were successful, sophisticated professionals carrying the burden of an aging widow who contributed nothing. The truth complicated that image too much. Richard interrupted my thoughts gently. "Evelyn," he said, "there are several board members here tonight who would love to see you again." Brianna blinked in surprise. "Board members?" Richard nodded calmly. "Many of them still remember who negotiated our emergency vendor contracts during the recession." Daniel stared at me again. "You handled negotiations?" "Sometimes," I answered quietly. Brianna let out a soft laugh that sounded almost brittle. "Wow. I had no idea Evelyn was secretly running Wall Street all those years." Richard's expression did not change. "No," he replied evenly. "She was busy raising a son while helping her husband prevent this company from collapsing." The silence after that sentence felt heavier than before. Daniel looked physically smaller somehow, as though the room itself had shifted around him. Brianna's jaw tightened for only a second before she recovered her polished smile once more. But I noticed people watching her differently now. Earlier they had laughed with her because power attracts agreement. Now uncertainty had entered the room, and uncertainty makes people cautious. A waiter passed carrying fresh champagne. Brianna quickly took one, her hand trembling just slightly. "Well," she said brightly, "I guess we are all learning new things tonight." Richard studied her carefully. "Yes," he said, "I believe we are." The rest of the evening unfolded differently after that. Nobody laughed loudly anymore. The executives who had once circled around Brianna now approached me carefully instead, asking polite questions about Walter, about the early years of the company, about memories I had not spoken aloud in decades. I answered simply and briefly. I never exaggerated. I never needed to. The truth carried enough weight on its own. Brianna remained beside Daniel near the bar for most of the evening, smiling too brightly and drinking champagne she barely touched. Every few minutes, I noticed her glancing toward me with the strained expression of someone desperately trying to calculate how much damage had already been done. Daniel looked worse. There was guilt in his face now. Confusion, too. He kept watching me as though trying to reconcile the woman standing quietly across the ballroom with the version of me he had accepted inside his own home. Richard eventually stepped away to greet investors near the stage, leaving me alone beside one of the tall windows overlooking the city. Snow continued falling steadily outside, covering the streets and rooftops in white silence. Chicago always looked softer during snowfall. Cleaner somehow. I wrapped my hands around a cup of coffee one of the servers had brought me and allowed myself a slow breath. "Mom." Daniel's voice came quietly from behind me. I turned slightly. He stood there alone now. Brianna was across the ballroom, speaking anxiously with two women from Human Resources, though they no longer looked particularly interested in listening to her. Daniel slid his hands into his pockets the same way he used to as a teenager whenever he felt ashamed. "I did not know," he said carefully, "about any of it." I studied his face for a long moment. "That depends what you mean." His jaw tightened slightly. "About what you did for the company. About Dad. About everything," Richard said. I looked back toward the snow outside. "You knew enough." Daniel exhaled heavily. "Mom, that is not fair." A sad smile touched my lips. "No, Daniel. What is unfair is watching your own child slowly become a stranger while convincing yourself it is temporary." He looked away immediately. For several seconds we stood there, in silence surrounded by distant music and low conversation. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "Brianna can be difficult sometimes, but she does not mean things the way they sound." That sentence hurt more than all the insults combined because I realized he truly believed protecting his marriage required diminishing my pain. I remembered another winter nearly 30 years earlier when Daniel was 10 years old and came home furious because another boy at school mocked his worn sneakers. Walter had sat beside him at the kitchen table while snow tapped softly against the windows. People reveal themselves by how they treat those they think cannot defend themselves, my husband told him gently. Never become that kind of man. I wondered what Walter would think if he could see his son now. Daniel rubbed one hand across his forehead tiredly. You know how corporate environments are? People joke around. Brianna tries hard to fit in. I turned fully toward him then. By humiliating your mother? That is not what she was doing. Then what exactly was she doing, Daniel? He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Across the ballroom, Brianna noticed us speaking privately and immediately began walking toward us in quick, graceful steps. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her posture. Everything okay over here? She asked lightly when she reached us. Daniel nodded too quickly. We are fine. Brianna slipped her arm through his possessively before turning toward me with another polished smile. Evelyn, some of the women from accounting were just saying how amazing it is that you stayed home while Walter built everything. I told them that kind of sacrifice barely exists anymore. The wording was careful now, respectful on the surface, but I noticed the subtle edge beneath it immediately. Brianna still needed the story to remain centered around Walter, around Daniel, around the men. In her version, I was useful because I supported greatness, never because I possessed any of it myself. Sacrifice, I repeated softly. Is that how you see it? Brianna laughed gently. Of course not in a bad way. I just mean women from your generation were different. Women from your generation. The phrase lingered in the air between us like perfume turning sour. I remembered balancing payroll spreadsheets at 2 in the morning while Daniel slept upstairs and Walter negotiated loans we were not sure we could repay. I remembered selling my father's watch to cover temporary insurance gaps for employees during the recession because Walter refused to lay people off before Christmas. I remembered learning every detail of vendor contracts because one careless signature could have destroyed everything we built. None of that looked impressive from the outside. Real power rarely does. Brianna tilted her head slightly. Honestly, I think it is beautiful when women know how to support their husbands without needing attention for it. Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately. He knew exactly what she was doing now. So did I. She was trying to shrink me back into the role she preferred. Quiet widow. Dependent mother. Decorative background. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. You are right, Brianna. Some women build quietly. Her smile widened in relief, believing she had regained control of the conversation. Then I added softly, that is usually why people fail to notice who is truly holding everything together until it is too late. The smile disappeared from her face almost instantly. After that conversation, Brianna stopped trying to joke for the rest of the evening. Instead, she became overly attentive in the way people do when they suddenly realize they may have underestimated someone important. She offered to refresh my coffee twice, even though she had never once asked whether I needed anything at home unless guests were watching. She complimented my earrings loudly near a group of senior managers. She even touched my arm gently while introducing me to a woman from legal affairs, as though we shared some warm private bond. The performance might have worked on strangers. It did not work on me. People reveal themselves most clearly during the moments when fear replaces confidence. Earlier that evening, Brianna had enjoyed humiliating me because she believed the room agreed with her version of reality. Now she sensed the room shifting away from her, and suddenly kindness became useful again. Daniel noticed it too. I could see embarrassment settling deeper into his face each time Brianna forced another bright smile in my direction. Near 10 o'clock, Richard invited several senior executives and longtime partners into one of the smaller private lounges connected to the ballroom. To my surprise, he asked me to join them. Brianna immediately volunteered Daniel as well. He has worked incredibly hard this year, she added quickly while smoothing the front of his suit jacket. I know he would value the opportunity. Richard gave a small nod. Of course. The private lounge overlooked the river, quieter than the ballroom and filled with dark leather chairs, polished wood tables, and soft amber lighting. A server brought sparkling water and coffee while the executives settled into relaxed conversation. Most of them were older men who had known Walter for decades. The moment I entered, several stood immediately to greet me. Evelyn Carter, one gray-haired man, said warmly. I have not seen you since the charity gala back in '98. Another smiled. Walter used to say you were the only reason vendors ever returned his calls during the recession. I smiled politely at the memories, though beside me, I felt Daniel becoming quieter with every passing minute. Brianna sat very straight in her chair, listening carefully while trying not to appear desperate. The stories continued naturally after that. Walter convincing exhausted employees to stay through difficult quarters because he trusted the recovery plan. Richard sleeping in his office during acquisition negotiations. Me reorganizing financial projections after midnight because one decimal error could have cost them a crucial contract. None of it sounded glamorous. That was the strange thing about real sacrifice. Most of it happens quietly while nobody is watching. Brianna finally interrupted with a small laugh. I cannot even picture Evelyn working in corporate finance. She is always so calm at home. Richard glanced toward her. Calm people are often the most dangerous in business. A few executives chuckled softly at that. Brianna smiled too, though less comfortably. One of the board members leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. You still own the original preferred shares, do you not, Evelyn? Daniel's head turned toward me immediately. Brianna froze completely. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Some of them. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel stared at me in confusion. Preferred shares, he repeated slowly. Richard folded his hands together. Your mother and father received equity during the restructuring in 1993. Brianna blinked rapidly. Wait, she said carefully. You mean stock? Nobody answered immediately because the answer was obvious. Daniel looked stunned. Mom, you never told me you still own part of the company. You never seemed interested in discussing your father's early years, I answered gently. Brianna let out another soft, nervous laugh. Well, I mean, everyone owns stock nowadays. Retirement accounts, mutual funds, not this kind. One of the older executives said casually before taking a sip of bourbon. Those original shares became extremely valuable after the expansion. Brianna's smile disappeared entirely. I watched the realization spread slowly across her face. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet calculation rearranging itself behind her eyes. Suddenly, all the small humiliations she directed toward me must have started replaying in her mind one by one. The jokes at dinner parties, the comments about bills, the introductions to neighbors as Daniel's mother who stays with us now. She had spent months treating me like a dependent inconvenience, while never understanding that the financial foundation beneath her own lifestyle partially rested in my hands. Daniel leaned forward slowly. Mom, are you saying you are financially involved with Bennett Financial? I received dividends, I answered simply. Walter wanted stability after retirement. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Richard added calmly, your mother has more business discipline than half the executives sitting in this building. Brianna looked physically pale now beneath the warm lounge lighting. Daniel, she whispered quietly, you told me your father handled everything. Daniel looked just as shaken. I thought he did. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment because I realized how little he truly knew about the people who raised him. Children often assume the loudest parent carried the family. Walter had charisma. He filled rooms naturally. I preferred silence and structure. But silence is not absence. Quiet women build entire lives while the world mistakes them for background decoration. Brianna lowered her eyes toward her untouched champagne glass. For the first time since I had known her, she had nothing clever left to say. By the time the party finally ended, the snow outside had turned the streets into quiet ribbons of white beneath the city lights. Valets moved briskly under the covered entrance while executives said their goodbyes in polished voices that sounded far more careful than they had earlier that evening. I stood near the revolving doors, buttoning my wool coat slowly while Daniel and Brianna waited beside me in tense silence. The ride home felt different before we even stepped into the car. Brianna no longer walked ahead of me with casual confidence. Daniel no longer treated me like background noise drifting through the edges of his life. They both moved carefully now, as though uncertain where they stood around me. Daniel drove, while Brianna stared out the passenger window almost the entire trip back to their house in Oak Brook. The windshield wipers moved steadily through falling snow, filling the silence with soft rhythmic sound. Nobody spoke for nearly 15 minutes. Then Brianna finally cleared her throat. Evelyn, she began carefully, I think tonight became awkward because people misunderstood my sense of humor. I kept my eyes on the passing streetlights outside. Did they? Her voice tightened slightly. I never intended to embarrass you. No, I answered calmly. You intended to diminish me. There is a difference. The car became silent again immediately. Daniel gripped the steering wheel harder. Brianna looked toward him as though waiting for support, but he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. For the first time in months, he seemed unable to hide behind avoidance. When we arrived at the house, Brianna hurried inside ahead of us without another word. I removed my gloves slowly in the foyer while Daniel lingered near the front door. The house felt unusually quiet after the noise and glitter of the ballroom. Soft kitchen lights glowed against marble countertops. A candle Brianna forgot to extinguish earlier still scented the air faintly with vanilla and cedar. For months I had moved through these rooms like a guest trying not to inconvenience anyone. That feeling was gone now. Daniel loosened his tie tiredly. Mom, he said quietly, can we talk for a minute? I nodded once and followed him into the library. Walter designed that room himself 20 years earlier. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with history books and financial journals he collected over decades. Even now, traces of him remained everywhere. The leather chair he loved near the fireplace. The brass reading lamp he repaired twice instead of replacing because he claimed modern lamps had no character. Daniel stood near the desk with both hands in his pockets. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Why did Dad never tell me how much you were involved with the company? He asked finally. I sat carefully in Walter's chair before answering. Your father believed children should grow up without carrying the weight of adult sacrifices. Daniel frowned slightly. That still does not explain why I knew almost nothing. I studied him quietly. Because you stopped asking about us a long time ago. The truth settled heavily between us. Daniel sat down across from me, rubbing one hand over his face. I did not realize things had gotten this bad. A small tired smile touched my lips. Things usually get bad slowly, Daniel. That is why people tolerate them for so long. He looked down at the carpet. Brianna can come across harsh sometimes, but she has always been under pressure to fit into this world. She worries constantly about appearances. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it explained everything so perfectly. Brianna had built her entire identity around proximity to status. Expensive neighborhoods, executive wives, perfect holiday, photos, designer dresses. She viewed people the same way she viewed furniture or jewelry. Valuable if they elevated perception. Embarrassing if they did not. An aging widow quietly living in her son's house did not fit the image she wanted to present. Do you know what hurt most tonight? I asked softly. Daniel looked up immediately. What? Not Brianna's words. His expression tightened. Then what? I folded my gloves carefully in my lap. Watching my son stand beside her and decide silence was easier. Daniel lowered his eyes again. For several seconds, the only sound came from logs shifting softly inside the fireplace. Then he spoke in a strained voice. I thought staying out of it kept peace in the house. No, I answered gently. It only taught her there would never be consequences. Upstairs, I heard faint footsteps moving through the hallway. Brianna was awake. Listening, perhaps. Worry changes the way people move through a home. They become quieter, more alert. Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair. I feel like I do not even know what is true anymore. I looked toward the shelves filled with Walter's books. The truth has always been there. You simply accepted the easiest version of it. He sat silently for a long time after that. Then, very quietly, he asked the question I think had been haunting him since the lounge conversation. Mom, how much of the company do you actually own? I met his eyes steadily. Enough that your father wanted me protected after he was gone. The color faded slightly from Daniel's face. Not because of greed. Not entirely. It was the realization that his entire understanding of power inside this family had been wrong. Upstairs, a bedroom door closed softly. Somewhere in the house, Brianna had heard enough. The next morning, the house felt unnaturally careful. That was the only way I could describe it. Every sound seemed softer than usual. Cabinet doors closed gently. Footsteps paused before entering rooms. Even the coffee machine hummed through the kitchen silence like something trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. I woke early, as I always did, and made myself breakfast before sunrise painted pale gray light across the backyard snow. For months, I had eaten quietly after everyone else left for work, almost like a guest waiting for permission to exist inside the home. That morning was different. I sat at the kitchen island with my coffee and oatmeal while reading financial news on my tablet, completely unhurried. At 7:30, Brianna entered the kitchen dressed in cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her phone tightly in one hand. The moment she saw me already seated there, she hesitated almost imperceptibly before forcing a bright smile. "Good morning, Evelyn." Her voice sounded too polished, too deliberate. I looked up calmly. "Good morning." She moved toward the espresso machine without meeting my eyes fully. I noticed she had barely slept. Tension lingered beneath her makeup despite her effort to hide it. For the first time since I moved into their house, she looked uncertain around me. That uncertainty irritated her. People like Brianna preferred social hierarchies to remain simple and visible. She understood how to manage assistants, neighbors, junior executives, restaurant staff. But she no longer understood where I belonged inside the structure she had created. "Daniel left early for the office," she said while preparing her espresso. "There is some issue with quarterly projections." I stirred my coffee slowly. "I imagine there are many issues this morning." Her hand paused briefly against the espresso cup. "If this is about last night, I already said I was joking." "No," I answered quietly. "You explained yourself. That is different." She finally turned toward me fully then. "You know, Evelyn, I think you enjoy making me look bad." I almost smiled at the absurdity of it. "Do I? Ever since Richard spoke to you at the party, everyone suddenly acts like I committed some terrible crime." She folded her arms tightly across her chest. "People joke in corporate circles all the time. I cannot control how sensitive others choose to be." Sensitive. There it was again. The favorite word of people who confuse cruelty with confidence. I set my spoon down carefully beside my bowl. "Do you know what the difference is between humor and humiliation, Brianna?" She said. "Nothing. Humor allows everyone to laugh. Humiliation only entertains the person holding power." Her expression hardened immediately. "Power," she repeated sharply. "You think this is about power? I think everything has been about power for quite some time." She let out a short cold laugh and shook her head. "You have no idea how difficult it has been living under constant judgment from you." That surprised me enough that I actually looked at her carefully then. "Judgment? You always acted so quiet and graceful while making me feel like I was never good enough for this family." I stared at her for a long moment. Beneath the arrogance and ambition, I suddenly saw something else. Insecurity. Brianna had spent years performing sophistication so aggressively that eventually she began resenting anyone who carried dignity naturally. "Brianna," I said gently, "I never judged you for wanting success." Her eyes flashed immediately. "That is easy for you to say when you already have everything." Everything. Such a dangerous illusion. People only saw the final version of a life. They never saw the years beneath it. The debts. The exhaustion. The sacrifices hidden inside ordinary days. Before I could answer, Daniel entered the kitchen again unexpectedly, still wearing his coat and carrying a folder beneath one arm. He looked exhausted already despite the early hour. His eyes moved between us immediately, sensing tension. "I forgot some documents," he muttered. Neither of us spoke. Daniel slowly set the folder onto the counter. "Mom," he said carefully, "Richard called this morning." Brianna straightened instantly. "What did he want?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "He asked whether Mom would be interested in attending the board dinner next month." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Brianna stared at him in disbelief. "The board dinner?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Apparently, several members requested it after last night." Brianna laughed softly, but there was panic beneath the sound now. "That is ridiculous. She has not been involved in the company for years." Daniel looked at her tiredly. "Neither has half the board." Brianna opened her mouth, then closed it again. I watched realization continue spreading through her piece by piece. Last night had not ended when the party ended. Conversations were still happening inside offices and executive suites all across the company this morning. People were remembering things, comparing stories, reassessing assumptions. Respect moves quietly through wealthy circles once it changes direction. Brianna suddenly placed her espresso cup down harder than intended. Coffee splashed lightly onto the marble counter. "So what now?" she asked, looking directly at me. "Everyone is supposed to bow because you secretly own stock." I reached for a napkin and wiped the spilled coffee calmly before answering. "No, Brianna. But it would have been nice if you had treated me with basic decency before you thought there might be consequences for doing otherwise." She stared at me silently. Then, without another word, She grabbed her purse and walked out of the kitchen. Seconds later, the front door slammed hard enough for the sound to echo through the house. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I do not know how to fix this," he admitted quietly. I looked down at the coffee stain fading beneath the napkin in my hand. "That is because you are only now realizing something was broken." Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere inside the house changed in ways neither Daniel nor Brianna could fully control. Respect had entered the room, and once that happens, people begin noticing things they previously ignored. Daniel became quieter around me, almost cautious. He started asking questions during dinner about Walter, about the early years of the company, about decisions I helped make during difficult financial periods. At first, his curiosity sounded uncertain, like someone carefully touching old wounds. Then gradually it became something heavier. Regret. Brianna reacted differently. She tried to regain control through appearances. She suddenly insisted I sit beside guests during neighborhood dinners instead of helping in the kitchen. She began introducing me properly when people visited the house. "This is Daniel's mother, Evelyn Carter," she would say with carefully measured warmth. Her husband helped build Bennett Financial. The correction sounded respectful, but I noticed what remained missing every time. My name existed now because it carried status, not because she valued me as a person. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking on the phone in the upstairs hallway while she thought the house was empty. "No, you do not understand," she whispered sharply. Apparently, she still owns original preferred shares. Richard Bennett practically worships her. If this gets around the executive offices, it changes everything. I continued folding laundry quietly downstairs without making a sound. That was another thing people misunderstood about older women. They assumed silence meant ignorance. In reality, silence often meant observation. A few days later, Daniel came home unusually tense. He loosened his tie immediately after entering the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water before speaking. "Someone leaked part of the holiday party video internally," he said quietly. Brianna froze near the stove. "What video?" Daniel looked at her directly. "The part where you called Mama Leech." Color drained slowly from Brianna's face. "That is ridiculous. It was private." Daniel laughed once under his breath, though there was no humor in it. Nothing is private once executives start sharing opinions. Brianna immediately turned defensive. "So now everyone is pretending they have never made jokes before." "This is not about jokes anymore," Daniel replied tiredly. "Human resources has already heard complaints." I stood near the sink, drying dishes slowly while they argued around me in strained, controlled voices. Months earlier, Daniel would have defended her automatically. Now he sounded exhausted instead. Brianna crossed her arms tightly. "People are only reacting because they suddenly found out your mother has money and influence." Daniel stared at her for several seconds before answering. "No, they are reacting because they watched you humiliate someone they respected while I stood there doing nothing." The silence after that sentence felt unfamiliar. Honest. Brianna looked genuinely shaken for the first time. Not angry. Afraid. She had built her entire social identity around perception, around appearing sophisticated, polished, admired. Now the same corporate circles she worked so hard to impress were quietly judging her instead. Respect moves upward quickly in wealthy environments. So does shame. That night, I sat alone in the library after dinner reading one of Walter's old market analysis books while snow drifted softly outside the windows. Daniel eventually entered carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to me carefully before sitting across from my chair. "Mom," he said after a long pause, "why did you stay quiet all those months?" I looked down at the steam rising from my cup. "Because grief changes your balance." He frowned slightly. I continued softly. "When your father died, everything familiar disappeared at once. I convinced myself that enduring discomfort was easier than losing more family." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. "I failed you." I could hear how difficult those words were for him. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just painfully sincere. "You abandoned yourself first," I answered gently. "That is why abandoning me became possible." He sat silently for a long time after that. Finally, he spoke again. "Brianna was not always like this." I almost smiled sadly. "No, Daniel. She simply became more comfortable showing who she already was." Upstairs, a door closed sharply. Brianna was awake again, listening again, living with fear, now the same way I once lived with humiliation. Strange how quickly roles can reverse once truth enters a house. 3 days later, Movers arrived unexpectedly that morning. Brianna stood in the foyer directing them while wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather outside. "What is going on?" Daniel asked, confused, as he came downstairs. Brianna removed her sunglasses slowly. "Evelyn deserves her own space," she said stiffly. "I found a beautiful luxury condo downtown near the river. Short-term lease. Fully furnished." I understood immediately. This was not generosity. It was retreat. Brianna no longer wanted me inside the house because my presence reminded her daily of what happened at the party and everything that followed afterward. Daniel looked stunned. "You rented Mom an apartment without discussing it with me?" Brianna's composure cracked slightly. "I thought everyone would be happier with more independence." I set my book down calmly. "Actually," I said softly, "I already arranged somewhere else to stay." Both of them looked at me in surprise. Richard connected me with a residential building near the board offices downtown. "I move tomorrow." Brianna blinked rapidly. "Tomorrow?" "Yes." Daniel looked genuinely hurt then. "Mom, you are leaving?" I met his eyes steadily. "No, Daniel. I am simply returning to a life where I do not need permission to exist comfortably." 3 months after I moved into the condominium downtown, spring finally arrived in Chicago. The snow disappeared from the sidewalks along the river, replaced by early morning joggers and rows of tulips outside polished glass buildings. My new apartment overlooked the water from the 23rd floor, quiet and sunlit in a way that felt strangely unfamiliar at first. Peace takes time to recognize after living too long inside tension. In the beginning, I kept expecting criticism to drift through every room. A comment about the groceries I bought. A joke disguised as concern. Footsteps outside my bedroom door reminding me I was occupying space someone else resented giving. None of that existed anymore. The silence in my new home belonged to me. Richard kept his promise about involving me with the company again, though not in the dramatic way Brianna probably feared. I did not return as some executive storming through offices demanding authority. That was never my style. Instead, I attended advisory dinners, reviewed long-term charitable initiatives, and occasionally met younger department managers for mentorship lunches Richard organized quietly. The respect I received now came naturally because it was no longer hidden behind assumptions. Daniel visited often during those first months, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for coffee after work. He looked different each time I saw him. More tired, more thoughtful. The confidence he once borrowed from Brianna's approval seemed to have faded, leaving behind a man finally forced to examine himself honestly. One evening he sat across from me at my dining table while city lights reflected softly against the windows behind him. "Human Resources completed their investigation last week," he said quietly. I continued slicing lemons for iced tea. "And?" Daniel rubbed one hand over his jaw. "Brianna was removed from client-facing projects." I paused slightly. "That must have been difficult for her." "It was." He hesitated. "Several executives refused to work with her after the video circulated wider internally." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Actions create reputations far more permanently than apologies repair them. Daniel stared down at the table for several seconds before speaking again. "I should have protected you." The sadness in his voice sounded genuine now, stripped of excuses. I sat down across from him slowly. "You were trying to protect the version of your life that felt easiest to maintain," I answered gently. "Most people do that until consequences arrive." He nodded once, unable to argue. Brianna never visited my apartment. Not once. At first, she sent polite text messages asking whether I needed anything. Then birthday flowers arrived with stiff formal cards signed only with her name. Eventually, even those gestures stopped. Some distances become permanent after truth removes the comfort of pretending. Richard invited me to the annual Bennett Foundation Gala in May, an event attended by executives, investors, and civic leaders from across the city. The evening was held at the same hotel where the holiday party happened months earlier. I almost declined the invitation at first, not because I felt fear, but because returning there felt symbolic in ways I was not sure I wanted to revisit. In the end, I accepted. The night of the gala, I wore a black silk gown Walter bought for me years ago before one of our anniversary dinners. Simple, elegant, timeless. As my car pulled beneath the glowing entrance canopy of the Hartford Regency, I felt strangely calm stepping back into the same ballroom where everything changed. Inside, Crystal chandeliers shimmered above crowded tables dressed in white linen and silver candlelight. Conversations softened noticeably when I entered. Then something unexpected happened. People stood, not everyone at once. One table, then another. Quietly, respectfully, executives approached to greet me. Board members shook my hand warmly. Several younger women from financial operations thanked me for advice I barely remembered giving during mentorship meetings. Across the ballroom near the stage, I noticed Brianna standing beside a group of employees in a dark blue gown that looked expensive but somehow tense against her posture. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly was gone now. Not destroyed, just smaller. Human. She saw me almost immediately. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the crowded room. Months earlier, I might have searched her face for guilt or shame. That night, I felt neither anger nor triumph. Only clarity. Brianna looked away first. Richard eventually joined me near the center of the ballroom, holding 2 champagne glasses. Quite a difference from last winter, he murmured softly. I accepted one of the glasses with a faint smile. People reveal themselves eventually. Including you, he said. I glanced around the ballroom slowly. The music, the laughter, the city lights beyond the tall windows. Months ago, I entered this room as someone others believed they could diminish safely. A widow, a burden, a quiet older woman standing politely beside the champagne tower while people laughed at her expense. The truth had not changed since then. Only visibility had. Daniel approached us moments later, dressed in a dark gray tuxedo with exhaustion still lingering faintly beneath his eyes. But there was humility there now too. Real humility. Mom, he said softly. They are about to begin the recognition speeches. Richard asked if you would sit at the front table. I looked toward the stage where the company logo glowed beneath warm lights. Then I looked briefly across the ballroom one final time. Brianna stood silent among the crowd, no longer laughing, no longer performing superiority for strangers. Just another employee watching carefully from the distance she created herself. I adjusted the bracelet Walter gave me on our 40th anniversary and rose calmly from my chair. People once mistook my silence for weakness because they only understood power when it arrived loudly. They never realized the strongest women often build entire worlds quietly, while everyone else takes credit for living inside them.